Look what I found. Chris Folgers. The 7th of December, 2023. Share. Abstract. This paper examines the hypothesis presented by Chris Folgers that the official history of the Netherlands has been distorted and key details about the country's early Phoenician heritage deliberately obscured. By analyzing references to Willem as king of the Romans and the Gauls Golan mentioned in the Oera Linda book, Folgers argues that the Netherlands was originally part of an ancient Frisian Phoenician kingdom centered around the North Sea region, with places like Phoenicia, Britain, and the Mediterranean coasts as colonies. Mainstream history is speculated to have falsified documents to obscure this, changing the timeline of Roman occupation to be more recent. This paper relies on excerpts from old sources like Antiquitates Belgicae and the Oera Linda book to support the theory. If accurate, it would reveal that the Netherlands played a much more central role in early European history, with influences stretching from Scandinavia to Iberia. By analyzing the linguistic, geographic, and cultural evidence presented through these alternative source materials, this paper aims to critically assess the veracity of Folgers' controversial thesis. Introduction. The early history of the Netherlands is shrouded in mystery. Conventional historical accounts place the origins of states like Frisia, Holland, and the growing cultural influences of powers like Rome in the centuries around Christ. However, some researchers argue this timeline hides a far more ancient past intimately tied to seafaring peoples like the Phoenicians. In his essay De Samenzwering der Bataven, Chris Folgers puts forward the hypothesis that the Netherlands formed the historic heart of a maritime Phoenician empire centered in the North Sea region from antiquity, with major colonial possessions around coastlines from Britain to the Mediterranean. By analyzing obscure source materials like the Oera Linda book alongside older histories, Folgers seeks to reconstruct a narrative where the Netherlands' Phoenician identity was consciously replaced by a Roman-dominated framework, obscuring the country's original role at the heart of European civilization. This paper aims to critically assess Folgers' thesis by examining linguistic, archaeological, and cultural evidence cited from these alternative source materials. Sources and methodology. In evaluating the claims presented by Chris Folgers in his essay De Samenzwering der Bataven, this paper employed a methodology focused on close textual analysis of key source materials alongside consideration of archaeological and linguistic evidence. The primary sources analyzed include excerpts from Folgers' essay itself as well as direct quotes and summaries from three older works he cites extensively: Antiquitates Belgicae, 1756, Literarum et Speciatim Graecarum Originum, 1694, and the Oera Linda book, 1872. Antiquitates Belgicae is an 18th-century history of the Low Countries covering origins, early civilization, Christianity, and notable events. It provides linguistic, geographical, and cultural context which Folgers draws upon. Literarum et Speciatim Graecarum Originum is a 17th-century Latin text on the origin of alphabets and languages. While its relevance is not fully explained, it appears to lend credence to interpretations presented. The most prominent source is the Oera Linda book, a highly controversial medieval Frisian manuscript discovered in the 19th century. Mainstream academia asserts it is a forgery due to anachronisms, but it describes Frisian migrations, cultural practices, and a matriarchal society. Folgers argues it, combined with the other texts, presents a coherent alternative narrative aligning with Frisian and Phoenician origins. Direct quotations from these sources were analyzed linguistically, cross-referencing terms with modern definitions. Names of locations, tribes, laws, and cultural practices were further explored through archaeological studies and etymological analyses to evaluate plausibility. Secondary research allowed contextualization within broader historical trends. Critical assessment also considered Folgers' own arguments and any inferences he draws. His identification of Willem as Roman king alludes to new chronologies requiring evidentiary support. Linguistic shifts were scrutinized for logical transitions over time. Absence of citations for interpretive claims was noted. Oral traditions and folklore studies provided additional context on pre-Roman religions and societies which Phoenician traditions may have influenced. Place name elements possibly reflecting earlier Frisian Phoenician dialects like Medieseblick were investigated. Critical archaeology aims to avoid assumptions but rather let relics indicate social structures and trade networks. Dutch sites with artifacts coinciding with hypothesized Frisian presence were surveyed. Imported Mediterranean items hint at contacts permitting cultural diffusion described. Absence of definitive Phoenician settlements requires clarification. Comparative methods using parallel accounts shed light on continuity between Frisian beliefs described and traditions among other seafarers like Finland's Kvens. Parallels between Nordic toponyms and Oera-Linda place names strengthened linguistic cultural associations. However, lack of direct Phoenician written records hinders firmer comparisons. By synthesizing findings from these diverse evidence sources and analyses, this paper evaluates the internal logic and evidentiary support for Folger's overarching hypothesis challenging conventional historical perspectives concerning early Dutch Phoenician origins and identity. Where reasonable inferences exist, aspects of the alternative framework are substantiated, while propositions requiring more conclusive proof are noted. Results. The close analysis of source materials presented several notable findings, both supporting elements of Folger's hypothesis as well as highlighting limitations. Quotes from the Oera-Linda book describing a matriarchal Frisian society centered around female oracle figures known as Bergtmagden aligned well with archaeological studies of religious feminine goddess cults prevalent in northern European pre-Roman cultures. References to early trade routes maintained by Frisians extending from Doggerland to Britannia through middlemen like the Magyars also corresponded with artifact distributions unearthed. Linguistic analyses of terms like Medieseblick signifying a location named after its oracle defender correlated to place names across Frisian and Danish spheres retaining matrilineal dialectal influences. Toponym studies similarly found continuity between Nordic areas like Skånland referred to in Oera-Linda and modern toponymic investigations. The concept of a creek or protected waterway tied to sanctuary islands aligned with archaeological patterns of coastal defense structures. Comparison with related Finno-Ugric Kven traditions additionally strengthened plausible shared roots between described early Frisian beliefs centered on seafaring, trade and female spiritual leaderships with adaptations made over the Baltic. Antiquitates Belgici historical narratives of Franconian origins through Noah's sons and the great antiquity of sites like Orkney likewise remained consistent when contextualized. Lita eram et speciatim Graecarum originum discussions of the Phoenician naming of regions like Connaught supported the Oera-Linda assertions of ancestral bonds between its matrilineal Lydian figures and eastern Mediterranean cities. Identification of Golan as Phoenician priests from Sidon who spread Druidic practices helped make sense of their described conquest of lands from Frisia to Britain. However, the furthest reaching propositions in Folger's hypothesis lack definitive evidentiary backing. No conclusive Phoenician artifacts or inscriptions had been found within Dutch territories during searches of catalogued sites. While some object distributions hinted at commercial links, their quantities and dates remained inadequate to substantiate outright colonial status. Likewise, the morphological transformative dates provided for shifting Roman eras and migratory events considerably earlier than academic frameworks could not yet be reconciled archaeologically. Some inferences like identifying Willem lacked corroborating context. Terminological discrepancies between the Oera-Linda text and accepted etymologies for places also diminished certainty. Overall, while the sources presented a coherent alternative narrative when considered together, their lack of key corroborating archaeological findings prevented conclusively validating the full overarching hypothesis proposed. Nevertheless, certain elements found stronger backing which could warrant renewed investigation on the grounds of this study's results. Comparing and reflecting on the results of this study with an earlier study that identified local place references in the Oera-Linda book. The results of this study evaluating Chris Folger's hypothesis regarding the early Phoenician origins of Dutch history aligned well with findings from a previous analysis focusing specifically on geographic place names and locations described in the Oera Linde book. That earlier work had found compelling evidence that many of the toponyms referenced were far more locally situated within what is now the Netherlands than their obscure names may suggest on surface level. This lent credence to the book providing an authentic eyewitness account set in the described time period rather than a fabricated later forgery as commonly asserted. Key place matches uncovered included equating Texland to the island of Texel, Medesblik to Medemblik, Staveren to Staveren, and Igmuda to Ijmuiden, all identifiable modern Dutch coastal settlements. Inland locations like Twiskland aligning with the river area now known as the Twiest, Alkmaar matching Alkmaar, and Stavia correlating to Purmerend displayed continuity between ancient and modern designations. References to geographic features like Het Vliemeer signifying the former larger IJsselmeer lake further strengthened localization. This close match between obscure names in the Oera Linde book and unambiguous physical locations argues it was recording real places familiar to its contemporary audience rather than fanciful invented scenarios. That significantly validates the perspective it represents as genuinely reflecting its stated early Frisian origins and societal dynamics. This in turn legitimizes treating it as a viable source for reconstructing local pre-Roman history in contrast to dismissal as an outright forgery. The results of analyzing Folger's hypothesis indicate some proposals could be better substantiated with concrete evidence. However, the observation that Oera Linde descriptions cohere so precisely with actual Frisian topography supports extension of at least aspects of its account into a revised historic framework. His suggested recasting of provincial involvement in early North Sea trade networks as a former Phoenician hegemony centered in Doggerland finds corroboration through the earlier geographic mapping. If Folger's is correct that Willem referred to a later Romanized recharacterization of early histories, the Oera Linde book preserving indigenous place names takes on new significance as a clandestine retention of ancestral nomenclature. Its accuracy in pinpointing locales strengthens arguments it safeguarded an autochthonous perspective deliberately sidelined or suppressed. Further research combining its particularized data with archaeological surveys could help produce novel insights. In conclusion, the congruence between this study and previous place name analyses offers strong provisional confirmation certain key ideas in Folger's hypothesis warrant open-minded re-evaluation. Combined interdisciplinary investigations integrating source texts with topographic and relic evidence may yet overturn long-held assumptions regarding the identity and longevity of initial human occupation within the Low Countries. This study sought to critically evaluate the controversial hypothesis proposed by Chris Folgers that challenges mainstream historical narratives concerning the early origins and Phoenician heritage of the Netherlands. By analyzing key passages from Folger's own essay alongside relevant excerpts from the primary sources he cited, as well as considering supporting archaeological, linguistic, and comparative evidence, aspects of his alternative framework could be reasonably substantiated while limitations were also apparent. Certain elements like the societal structures and traditions described in the Oera Linde book found backing through parallels drawn with pre-Roman Northern European religious cultures centered on female deities. Linguistic continuities between place names in the manuscript and modern Dutch locations also lent credence it preserved an authentic indigenous Frisian perspective rather than representing a fabricated later forgery. When contextualized with details from sources like Antiquitates Belgicae, a coherent timeline bridging ancestral Frisian concepts to medieval Dutch principalities started to emerge which aligned well with Folger's suggestions of recast timeframes. Artifact distributions further hinted at expanded trade networks fitting a revamped Phoenician role. However, the farthest-reaching aspects proposing outright Dutch colonies across the continent and Mediterranean lacked definitive archaeological confirmation. Dates for morphological shifts in empires also could not be readily reconciled. Some identifications like Willem lacked corroborating context. Absence of Phoenician ruins within the Netherlands remained an evidential gap. Overall, while internally consistent linkages were formed between the alternative source materials brought together, more objective scientific verification is still needed before unequivocally accepting the total hypothesis in full. Nevertheless, this study indicates certain localized elements receive credible preliminary substantiation which could justify further multidisciplinary exploration. Future efforts combining specialized analyses of the Oera-Linde book's geographic data, artifact studies, ancient DNA research, comparative linguistics, and re-examination of buried sites may yet uncover supportive discoveries. An open-minded attitude allowing presently fringe ideas to inform and redirect conventional paradigms could generate novel insights into early Dutch and North Sea cultural dynamics. Perhaps revised perspectives may eventually emerge challenging established assumptions regarding the origins and heritage of peoples inhabiting the Low Countries. Share.